The number one question I get asked over and over again, I can count on it when I wake up in the morning and check my Gmail. The number one question is, are we headed for potential disaster? And how does this tie into all the tariff stuff that's going on? Should I be worried? Well, today we're going to take a trip down memory lane and we're going to look at some of the history of tariffs and tariff wars and trade wars that have occurred through history and the effects they've had and the way that they've unwound over time. This will be a very interesting segment because we're hearing about tariffs on the one hand, but we're not getting the full story, and we're also not getting a historical context on what it means for trade. We're going to get into that today, and let me tell you, if you're a citizen in the world today, you have an interest in what's coming. So my best advice, get yourself educated and understand what is at stake. Let's get into it today. And a very good morning to all of you as we wind through the month of February here. And yes, trade, tariffs. Of course, there's issues also about dismantling the executive branch of government. There's a lot of misunderstanding about that and who has the power to decide what stays and what goes. It all has to do with three co-equal branches of government and which one has power over which one and which one should keep out of the business of the other ones. And we're going to talk about that in a future one. But we've come a long way over the last 40 years, particularly in things like equity and wealth generation in the United States. When I think back to 1982, when I was in August of 1982, when I was in graduate school pursuing my MBA, back on the East Coast, the Dow Jones Industrial Average was at 777. Lucky 777. And little did we know that it was going to kick off a massive 43-year bull run that would bring us up to Dow for almost 45,000 here. What a move. You can imagine in that time the way the United States economy grew, as well as the way that wealth grew in the United States through equity markets and things like that, stock markets. But stock markets can be punctured, as we've seen in history, 1987, 1998, particular 2000, 2008. And of course, 1929, where stocks lost almost about 90% of their value. What goes up, what goes up definitely comes down because countries change in terms of the dynamics that put them in a position to generate wealth, and that starts to come under threat. While other countries that have been typically poor for a long time start to rise up. We think of India and nations like that are really starting to make the mark after, it takes a long time to build that base of progress where it becomes enough to start to lift up an economy, and then it picks up a momentum of its own. Conversely, economies can start to be rocked by inefficiencies and then start to come down and nations start to deteriorate. As I've said in prior videos, though, the tariffs are the biggest threat to, not tariffs, but debt is the biggest threat to our future here. And no matter how much you've seen recently, no matter how much the president made jawbone 10-year interest rates, they continue to just creep up, kind of like a vampire from the grave, right? Ready to pounce and do their deed. And you say, what level is going to be problematic? If we breach 5%, it'll be a little dicey. If we breach 6%, and I would fasten your seatbelts. Okay, so we're getting off here on this. Understand now that this is not the first time that President Trump has engaged in a trade war. We had him before, but we need to set the stage and understand what's happening to us in the world, right? And we look at a nation like China today, which across the board has an average of 6.7, somewhere around 6 to 7% generalized tariffs on products coming into the nation. But against the United States, on average, products are a tariff of about 21%, way out of line with the rest of the world, and very discriminatory towards the United States. For a lot of years, it didn't matter. Okay, we'll take the hit. We're in the World Trade Organization, general agreements of tariffs and trades. Okay, developed nations should get an advantage in lower tariffs to help them lift their standards of living and lift people out of poverty. And of course, that was the theory of China, an ostensibly communist country that suddenly full on embraced capitalism. And now we've reached a point 50 years on, where China is now a legitimate economic world power. So should there be equivalent trade? Well, Trump thinks we need to certainly level things up with China, and probably has the opinion that, well, they're past a developing nation status now, and they're a development nation. So what they do to us, we're going to do to them. And the first round of tariffs has already come in. We're on hold with Mexico and Canada. Remember, we had a North American free trade agreement. There's a lot of moving parts out there. General agreement on tariffs and trades, World Trade Organization, and these kind of places. They believe they have a lot of say in things, but remember, country economics are moving parts. There's always countries gaining in economic stature, and there's always countries losing in economic stature. For example, England, after dominating for hundreds and hundreds of years, there's no doubt that the problems and declining manufacturing base and declining prosperity is spreading itself across the United Kingdom, and it's creating great difficulties. But through history, we've seen examples, and people ask me, well, what's happened in the past? Okay, so we slap these tariffs on. How does it all end in the end? Well, a lot of that depends who's in the White House, and I don't want to say the size of the ego, but let's just say, how alpha male are you, right? I mean, how much do you want to stand up, put the consumers in the crosshairs and say, you know what, I don't care what it takes. We're just going to break you down to size. We're going to slap these tariffs on and, well, fasten your seatbelts and tough it up, right? Be masculine, right? Take the hit. We're past a really masculine nation now, but you get the point that I'm saying. But history is a pretty good guide to what came before. And I've talked before about the 1930s Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act. It was to not precipitate the depression, but it acted as a really nice push down the hill to really accelerate the snowball of declining prosperity by sinking world trade 60%. As the United States imposed tariffs on other nations, reciprocal tariffs hit the United States, right? And then other countries wouldn't get involved and raise, well, we're going to see your 8% and we're going to raise it to 12%. How do you like us now? Well, I see your 12%. Now we're going to raise it to 15%. We had this back and forth of tariff rises. It was ultimately resulted in what? Almost a 2/3 reduction in world trade exports from the United States. It was an absolute killer, especially when coupled with a banking panic and coupled with depressed economic conditions. It was like an extra, right? It's like an extra wound on this arm when you're already dealing with 3 here. Ultimately, the 1934 Act by Roosevelt started to slowly repeal those tariffs, and as a result, international trade picked up. But courtesy of History.com, I want to enlighten you with the way some other tariff wars have ended, because I think it's important that you be educated and understand what's really going on here. In the 1960s, we had what were called the chicken wars here, right? I know you guys are like, don't talk about eggs, don't talk about chickens. I'm so sick of this bullshit. $8 a dozen for eggs. No eggs in Costco. Man, I hate this world, right? And even Waffle House is imposing a 50-cent per egg tariff on top of what I'm getting there. But back in the 1960s, because of the tremendous productivity of the U.S. agricultural sector, cheap chickens were flooding Germany and France and a lot of Europe. And, well, they believed it threatened their own chicken industry because there was no way that they could produce chickens as cheaply as those coming in from the United States. So they imposed tariffs, and on the United States they imposed a 25% tariff at that time. The U.S. reciprocated with its own 25% tariff, and this is very interesting because the tariff was on VW buses and light trucks, right, and also French brandy, potato starch, and dextrin. A lot of these taxes are still in place, and people wonder, well, how did Japanese vehicles conquer the U.S. market, but the truck market was a lot more difficult because they're still laboring under that tax today. Therefore, a lot of the Japanese companies ended up building some production plants in the U.S., which was a great way to bypass the tariff. So was that tariff effective? It's actually still in place in a lot of ways. We had the Canadian and U.S. lumber wars, which are still going on today. You have to remember something, but you have to know something very important about the Canadian lumber industry. And the Canadian lumber industry harvests softwoods, building material, right? 2x4s, 2x4x8s, 12, 16. They harvest that on public lands, okay? And the Canadian government sets the price for that. In the United States, our softwoods, pines, trees for 2x4s, framing material and all that, though that is harvested on private land and the market sets the price. So by 1982, under the Reagan administration, Canada was accused of unfairly subsidizing their soft timber industry by getting an unfair advantage, and it's resulted in years of dispute that still go on today. You have to understand, Canada is a much more socialist country than the United States, with the government involved in many more aspects of the economy. I've already mentioned that although Canadian banks are free to operate, Toronto Dominion had Charles Schwab, and that went. But U.S. banks are not allowed to operate in Canada, so there's no reciprocity there. But Western Canada lumber prices were up by 40% by 2018. At the same time, the building boom was going on, resulting in higher prices. What's the outcome of it? It's still running today. So higher costs and things like that are just a built-in part of the lemon. 1993, this is a really interesting one. We had the banana wars, all right? You may think that banana plantations in Costa Rica and all these Central American countries, they're all owned by indigenous corporations of those nations. A lot of them are owned by like Dole and Castle and Cook, and a lot of these are American companies that own these. And the Europeans got really tired of taking imports of bananas, which ostensibly came from Central American countries, but really benefiting the United States. So they added tariffs on top of bananas precisely because these plantations were U.S. owned. So the U.S. retaliated with putting tariffs on handbags from France. Man, that hit. That hurt, right? The British linens and Danish hams. In 2012, the EU agreed to start easing those tariffs. So the route seems to be tariffs go on, they hurt everybody, right? And then over time, they start backing down. We also had the 2002 steel tariffs where the United States put up tariffs on foreign steel. It was under the first Trump administration. And I mean, it's just tariffs, tariffs, tariffs. You're just going to hear it. But the thing that's different this time, we have sort of this alpha male mentality that I'm not backing down, bro, and you better get with the program. So it's going to make it very interesting coming up. So who ultimately wins in these tariff wars? Well, obviously Customs is collecting more tariffs, right? In all countries. The losers are always consumers. They're the ones that face that tax that comes from tariffs that makes things more expensive. And remember what I said. Main point of tariffs, forget about the trade wars and stuff like that. Tariffs automatically are another revenue stream that comes into the United States Treasury. And we see this frantic push right now to cost cutting, getting rid of this department, that department, 50, 60,000 federal worker buyouts, this and that. It's a massive move to cut expenses and to cut the budget, bring in that revenue from tariffs, and offset some of the gaping and huge budget deficits, something on the order of $2 trillion a year that are just, they're untenable for the future. We'll have a lot to say about that in terms of cutting, because while spending grows things, cutting tends to have a depressing effect. And we're going to do a little theorizing on that in a future video. Well, if you've enjoyed this, make sure you share it out with loved ones and people that you think you'd like to see keep informed about some opinions on what's going on with trade, with politics, and things like that. As usual, my inbox is overflowing with issues to discuss one at a time, one at a time, one at a time. Right now, trade is a critical one. And a lot hangs on that because, well, the world economy is a lot more precariously balanced than you may think. And once economies start to spiral down, it's very difficult to pump up the balloon again and get things going, okay? All right, guys, we'll be covering that in future videos. Once again, share it out on your social media and hit that subscribe button and that bell for all notifications. I'm really gratified that people are enjoying these discussions, because to be informed is to be ahead of the game. All right, so subscribe and hit that bell for all notifications, and I'll see you guys around. Thanks, everybody.